Welcome back to Becking News, where we break down the breaking news utilizing facts because you can't run from the truth. So where better to start than the one policy that almost every single Democratic candidate agrees on? Free access to healthcare, better known as Medicare for all. We're going to break down the two biggest justifications for the Medicare for all system to better understand why it would not only be an utter failure for the United States, but the world as a whole. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, followed by most of the proponents of this type of system, will claim that it's cheaper and more effective than what we currently have in place. Followed by the statement that anybody who disagrees with them clearly doesn't care about the thousands of people that die from lack of care in this country. Now, disclaimer, I'm not saying our system is perfect. No system is, and in its current state, our current system needs a lot of work. However, I don't advocate for systems that have proven time and time again to be utter failures. Starting off, we need to understand the difference between quality and cheap. There are two major pieces of data advocates for the Medicare for All system will often cite. First is a World Health Organization study which ranked the U.S. with the 37th best healthcare. Now that sounds bad until you take a look at the full study. Not only does the list rank the U.S. far behind socialist countries like Canada and the U.K., but also puts it on par with nations like Saudi Arabia and Cuba. You'll be asking, how is this possible? Well, when you actually look at the way the data was collected, you'll find that it doesn't prioritize the actual healthcare of a given nation. Instead, it prioritizes opinion polls of citizens and how they believe their country is doing and whether or not they're satisfied with their care. By the way, France ranked number one because it spends the most per capita on healthcare per citizen. So in order to get a better ranking on this list, we should just throw away the quality of care we actually give our citizens in favor of how many people we can reach. It doesn't matter if you were healed from whatever ailed you in the first place, so long as we gave you some sort of care, we would get a higher rank on this list. This metric is absolutely ludicrous. Take this for example. You have one rich guy that has more money than he knows what to do with, so he buys a Bentley. On the other hand, you have a guy that barely makes enough money to get by, scrapes and saves, and buys a 2010 Corolla. Now, when asking them how they rate their cars, the guy with the Bentley says he thinks it's okay. It rides a little rough. It's not his favorite car he owns. On the other hand, the guy with the Corolla says he absolutely loves it. It's the newest car he's ever owned. That doesn't mean the Corolla was a better car than the Bentley. But by that logic, all these countries that we're talking about would have the best possible healthcare systems because whichever portion of their citizens were polled said that they loved their healthcare systems. It doesn't work. The second source of data often referenced by the left is a 2013 Commonwealth poll that ranked 11 countries on their healthcare systems, and it ranked the U.S. at number 11. Oh, and if, by the way, at this point you still aren't convinced there's no actual metric for the way the left forms these lists, the UK is ranked number 1, and on the previous World Health Organization list was listed at 18. I don't know how that's possible. If the country has the best possible healthcare, you can switch it by 17 positions. That doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, this poll took two major factors into consideration: average mortality rate and infant mortality rate. Once again, we have a case of correlation, not causation, because mortality rate isn't directly linked to healthcare. Instead, it's more directly linked to self-care. For example, the US has a much higher obesity rate than most other first world countries, meaning there would be a much higher premature death rate because of that. It's not a direct cause of people not having access to healthcare, rather them not taking care of themselves. Next, onto the infant mortality rate, another number that's completely skewed when you look at how the data is actually collected. Because of the quality of our healthcare, we consider all preemie babies, no matter the age or the weight they are, if they die, to be considered part of the infant mortality rate. In other words, in some countries, if you're born at a certain time or under a certain weight, you aren't considered part of the infant mortality rate, throwing these numbers way off. Finally, this poll also excludes disability-suggested life, aka those countries with the ability to keep individuals with disabilities alive longer, like the US. All of that isn't enough to convince you that the socialized healthcare programs are fundamentally broken. Let's compare some hard numbers between France, Germany, Canada, the UK, and the US to find out exactly which countries do better in the realm of healthcare. Starting off, the US has 9 times the number of MRI machines than the UK. The US also has 3 times the number of CT scanners than Canada per capita. In the UK, 50% of people with breast cancer don't survive. Germany, 33%, but the US has less than a 25% fatality rate from breast cancer. In the US, prostate cancer has an 80% survivability rate. The UK, 43%. France and Germany are both almost 51%. This is the part that blows my mind and makes me so angry at the whole situation. The emotional rhetoric the left pushes that isn't backed up by facts or evidence, just your emotional vulnerability and desire to feel the same way they do. When it comes to Medicare for All, their favorite statement is that if you don't agree with them, then you obviously don't care about the 40,000 people that die each year in this country from lack of access to healthcare. If you want to play that game, I can play that game too. How come you don't care about the system that leads to thousands of people's death because of lack of proper healthcare? Why don't you care about the 100% increase in breast and prostate cancer patients in a system that prioritizes socialized healthcare? The Daily Mail recently conducted a study researching the survivability rate once being accepted into a hospital in Canada, the US, and the UK. They found that in the US, you were 4 times more likely to survive that hospital trip than in the UK or Canada. One of the largest contributing factors to this they found was the average wait time. They found specifically in Canada, there are over 1 million individuals on prolonged hospital acceptance wait lists, costing the Canadian government over $1.9 billion annually in lost wages. Finally, take a guess which country is ranked number 1 when it comes to research and creation of new pharmaceuticals. That's right, the good old US of A. So when adding quality to the conversation of healthcare, there's no competition between which countries are the most successful when it comes to keeping their citizens alive with the best quality healthcare for the cheapest amount. People like to scream and yell about the fact that they don't understand how the world's richest country doesn't have a socialized system and that gives all of its citizens healthcare. But I urge you to take a second and think about the situation. If every other country is socializing their healthcare programs and aren't the richest, and we are the only nation that doesn't have a socialized system and somehow we're the richest country, let's look at the common denominator and decide which factors are leading to success and failure. The second major platform the left uses when defending the Medicare for All platform is the idea of medical bankruptcy. This is the idea that the medical bills are increasing so rapidly and at such a rate that it's causing massive bankruptcies all over the US. Unfortunately, this logic is founded on a fallacy. The most recent study that most of this evidence is based off of has one major issue. It assumes that if at any point prior to bankruptcy the individual had medical debt, then that medical debt must have been the cause of the bankruptcy. Once again, this is a case of not understanding correlation versus causation. I can't wait for the day that we finally figure out the difference between the two and start having an educational conversation. The final nail in the coffin for this particular argument is that a vast majority of people who suffer from medical debt don't go bankrupt. So yeah, it's a fallacy. Another day, another extremist policy debunked. Thank you guys so much for listening, but as always, I encourage you to continue the conversation, do your own research, and come up with your own conclusions, and continue to have civil conversations to continue the learning and understanding of these very important policies and how they're going to shape our nation as a whole. But as always, remember, you can't run from the truth.